is the next stage of capitalism. But just a sidebar comment. I've been involved with WWF since 1961 when I was 11. It's been a great privilege, and also with 2 Degrees, which I know is involved in this exercise. I've been involved with them since an early stage. So just to acknowledge those links, relationships, and debts in a way. And I'm going to talk about tomorrow's bottom line, but more of that in a moment. So this menu slide just gives a few of the themes that I'm going to touch on. A few words of introduction to who we are. A couple of slides on some research that GlobeScan and Sustainability did recently. Then I'm going to focus in on a recent report that we launched with Generation Investment Management about a week ago. And then I'm going to dig in just briefly to zero-based targeting, which is an area of great interest to us at the moment. And I'm going to end with a question for those people who are on the line. So first, a few words by way of introduction, and I'll keep these very short, but for those who don't know me and us, I've been an environmentalist for 40 years. I've set up 3 companies: Environmental Data Services, 1978, Sustainability in 1987, and most recently, Volans in 2008, and that's where I'm now calling from. And the focus of our work is largely with big companies, and some of those companies have solutions, and some of those companies are in trouble. And so Sustainability, one of the companies that I mentioned, works, for example, with one of the banks that's been in quite a lot of trouble, and that has been Barclays. And if you look around the world at the moment, and we work with a group called Polecat, who have a database called MeaningMine, and for the Breakthrough project, which I'll talk about briefly in a moment, we had them review the language that is used around capitalism or in relation to capitalism in different parts of the world, including in countries like Canada, India, China, and so on. And the third image there just gives some of the themes, the terms that we used, and this was part way through last year. I'm pretty sure it hasn't changed very much, but the key point is that capitalism is going through one of these periodic crises which come along every so often. And in the books that I've done since 1980, 18 of them to date, I've tried to pick up on elements of that. So on the left-hand side, Cannibals with Forks explored the concept of the triple bottom line. The Power of Unreasonable People with Pamela Hartigan looked at the lessons to be learned from social entrepreneurs around the world. Last year, we launched a book called The Zeronauts, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, looking at zero-based targeting in a range of different areas. And I'm currently working on my 19th book with Jochen Zeitz, shown here. Some of you will know him as the former CEO of Puma, and will also know that Puma and PPR, their holding group, have been working on environmental profit and loss accounting methods, and also now social profit and loss accounting. So just a couple of quick slides to give a sense of the context where we currently think we see ourselves. And GlobeScan, the Canadian polling agency, surveying agency, and Sustainability last year polled 1,600 experts around the world. Maybe some of the people on the line were part of that survey. And I'm not going to spend very much time on this diagram, but what it shows is, towards the top right-hand corner, is a series of priority issues that are considered by those experts as both increasingly urgent in terms of priority, and also really quite difficult to solve. And I think 2 things. One is, if you had gone back 10, 15 years, you would have had fewer items identified as priorities in that space. But secondly, I think if you look at the number of these things, and some of the ones that are outliers as well, what increasingly I think we see is evidence of a systemic crisis, not just single issues anymore, but these things are all in one way or another linked. And very often climate change sits at the heart of all of this. And then the second slide from the same work, again 1600 experts, showed a very, very clear nexus of challenges that increasingly we face. And most prominent is the lack of political will. I don't think anyone needs to be reminded of the failures of the Rio +20 summit and the Doha conference and so on. For whatever reason, politicians are finding it very difficult to engage with some of these issues, not least because of the global downturn. And the three bars that you see beneath that include vested interests in the current order and a great deal of lobbying to protect that existing order. The complexity of many of the issues, and that links back to the previous diagram, which showed that these things are increasingly crowding together. But for most people, the links are not intuitive, not at least as yet. And then there's the failure of markets, and particularly financial markets, to recognize the importance of all of this. So that's the context, and in many ways it's peculiarly bleak at the moment. But I happen to believe personally that it's at moments like this where our species is backed into a corner, where we eventually, after trying pretty much everything else, break out with new technologies, new business models, and critically new mindsets, and ultimately new values. So the next section is just drawing on the report that we've just, as I said, launched. But as context again, some of you may remember the Accenture study for the UN Global Compact in 2010. 76 CEOs around the world interviewed, of whom 81% said that they had already embedded sustainability. And when we saw that statistic, and that 93% of people felt that they understood sustainability and it was important to their companies going forward, some part of my brain thought, well, we've arrived, and some part of my brain thought, well, but not quite where we wanted to be, because if people are understanding sustainability as a citizenship or CSR set of issues or agenda, then we really have a considerable problem. And behind the work that we do is this diagram. Many of you will have seen it, I suspect, in different iterations. We started the work at sustainability in 1994. A series of waves are sketched here. Much more discussion of this in the report. But our feeling is very strongly that the fourth wave, which was the wave that in many ways got all of those CEOs thinking that sustainability was important and that they broadly understood what it meant for their businesses, by which they meant reporting and stakeholder engagement and supply chain management and so on, that wave has been falling back from its peak period for about 18 months now. And that's been confirmed by a recent GlobeScan study of, I think, 20 countries, in which they showed that concerns around environmental issues are now at a 20-year low. Now, this is not unexpected at this sort of point in the cycle, and some of the most useful work tends to get done in the down waves. On the right hand of the slide, you will see three images, and they symbolize three scenarios. And I'm just going to very quickly walk us through those. But before I do, I would say that although I wish it were otherwise, this agenda is still very often largely driven by crises and to some degree disasters, and the Superstorm Sandy events were an example of that. So the first scenario is a breakdown scenario, and not hard to find examples. So if you look at oceanic fisheries at the moment, you look at the recent sale of a bluefin tuna in the Tokyo fish market for well over $1 million. Economics is not working in favor of the biosphere. And the only place that I've ever physically collided with a bluefin tuna was in Greece, which in a very different way is also a symbol now of almost teetering on the edge of collapse, in this case, economic collapse. So the breakdown scenario is very much out there, and in a way we're able to see elements of that in a way that wouldn't have been previously the case. So on the left of this slide you have iPhones, and one of the striking things in terms of radical transparency is that pretty much everyone now in the street is carrying a camera with them. We've seen that in wars like Syria. The level of transparency now is astonishing by historical standards. The right-hand pair of images, many people will recognize Good Guide, the app that enables people to go into supermarkets, scan barcodes and get a sense of the companies behind the products and the brands and some of the issues that they are involved in, for better or worse. And then there's another set of technologies in terms of transparency. And just recently I did the genetic testing that 23andMe, as just one of the companies involved in that space, offer. And people are electing to do that sort of work, but the same tests are now being used to study, for example, food. And so we suddenly discover that I happen to be a vegetarian, but people who are eating what they think are beef are finding many other things in there. So that transparency environment, I think, is immensely important. And the breakdowns that would once have been out of sight increasingly will be more apparent to us. And the question is then, what do we do? The second scenario, change as usual, immense amount of good work being done by immensely good people and well-intentioned people in this space, and this isn't at all meant to be dismissive. This particular illustration combines the International Integrated Reporting Council logo at the top with a painting, a watercolor that came out of the Financial Review, an Australian financial magazine. And it's about integrated reporting. And I think what we're seeing in that space at the moment is both immensely exciting and slightly worrying, because I think, and I've recently stood down from the board of the Global Reporting Initiative and from the International Integrated Reporting Council, not because I think reporting is unnecessary. I think it's very much part of that wider transparency trajectory, but because I think we are in danger of letting integrated reporting in particular be captured by the accountants. Nothing wrong with accountants, but they're not ecologists, and they have an interest in boiling things down to the financials. So looking beyond the changes usual scenario, again, I'm all right. I'm sorry, this is being very slow and tricky, and I'm just going backwards. Apologies for this. Hopefully that will stay where this diagram, the cover is a report that we did about 18 months, 2 years ago, the Future Quotient. But the diagram that for some reason has spun off the edge of the slide shows a typical innovation curve where you have the innovators and the early adopters, but then you have what the innovation scientists call the chasm, and the red arrow should be pointing at the chasm in this particular case, because in the case of sustainability, I think we've hit that moment where we are butting up against some pretty robust barriers. And the diagram that I have up now, which shows a F-18 fighter going through the sound barrier, is an attempt to provide some sort of metaphor for where we are. I think we are banging up against what we call the sustainability barrier. It will give in the end, just as the sound barrier did, but it is going to take immense effort. And if you look at the sound barrier, when I was born in the late 40s, planes were actually breaking apart in midair as people tried to get through the sound barrier. Now an individual, in this case Felix Baumgartner, can actually break the sound barrier on his own. But we're much more interested, not surprisingly, in the sustainability barrier. Last year, we held our first Breakthrough Capitalism Forum in London. All white men shown here on the panel, I'm afraid. BP and HP among the companies, Jeremy Leggett of Solar Century, and David Blood of Generation Investment Management, somebody who partners obviously with Al Gore at Generation, but was previously managing director of Goldman Sachs Asset Management. And the reason why we have a fifth white male up on the right-hand side is that's Joseph Schumpeter, who many people will recognize, the economist who talked about economic cycles, and particularly periods of what he called creative destruction. And it is our very strong sense that we are in the early phases of one of those periods of our collective history. So in terms of what breakthrough means for us, there are four key elements of the successful strategies and solutions that at least we've seen to date. And the first is that they are designed to work in a future where, whether we like it or not, world population pushes towards 9 or 10 billion people and is increasingly urbanized. They are not single issue solutions, that very often they're aiming to address systemic challenges, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. They have a social dimension, and in many cases almost a sort of a moral dimension. They aim to be fair, and that's not just in terms of people alive today. There is a growing concern in some quarters. I mean, you think about the crime, so-called, of ecocide, that we're cascading debt to future generations. That might be through climate, it might be through loss of species or whatever. And then finally, and I think perhaps most critically of all, they're disruptive. They bring the possibility of radically shifting the current system. And this diagram, which is in the report, is an attempt to lay that out, the breakthrough trajectory. And it runs, and for the sake of time, I won't go through it in any detail, but from denial, the point where companies in particular, business in particular, uses lobbyists to fend off claims on their time and resources. Basically says, there's not an issue, or if there is an issue, it's nothing to do with us. And over time, this cranks through the sort of compliance period where lawyers are also involved. Corporate social responsibility, which is a critical transitional moment in all of this, but very often to do with citizenship and defensive strategies. Social innovation, which is where people like Muhammad Yunus start to sort of almost reinvent sectors like microfinance stroke banking. But ultimately, the challenge being a systemic crisis. And increasingly, it's not just chief sustainability officers that are being sucked into this debate, but it's CEOs and CFOs and many more people in the global C-suite. So the next diagram comes from a group in the United States called Solve for X, and they're part of a growing movement. The X Prize Foundation would be one, Google X would be another, SpaceX, Elon Musk's space venture would be yet another. And all of these organizations are trying to use new forms of technology, new business models, and entrepreneurial initiative to tackle huge systemic problems. And we are particularly excited about some of these ventures and trying to understand them better. And I just want to focus down towards the conclusion on one group of people we've been watching with quite some attention, what we call the Zeronauts. But this map, produced a couple of years back by the World Economic Forum, and it's been updated, and those who haven't seen their Global Risks 2013 online platform, I recommend it very highly indeed. But this diagram, when we first saw it a couple of years back, reminded us of nothing so much as the Gordian knot through which Alexander sort of sliced with his sword. And in many ways, the people who are now using zero-based targets in areas like waste, carbon, toxics, and so on, are using zero as a sort of a concept to cut through complexity. And we saw it originally in areas like safety and total quality, and now it's spreading more broadly. And one of the well-known, but now sadly departed champions was Ray Anderson of Interface with his Mission Zero. When I talked to him just a couple of months before he died, he said that they were already 60% along that track. Another company which I see as right at the forefront of this particular trajectory is Herman Miller, the furniture company. If you haven't seen their short animation, it's actually very funny, but it actually gets to the point. And what's striking about Herman Miller is how they've now achieved 80, 85, 90% improvements in some of their critical areas around toxics, pollution, and so on. Then another, what we think is a very exciting initiative, which was instigated, catalyzed by Greenpeace with their detox campaign, but forced or encouraged a range of sportswear brands, some of them shown here, and a range of retailers who sell the related products, to look at the question of how they could push towards zero toxics, zero waste, zero pollution, the suppliers deep back down in their supply chains into China. Not something that the Chinese particularly welcome being pressured on, and when three organizations, Forum for the Future, Sustainability, and ourselves, facilitated a process with these companies in Holland, what was, I think, quite remarkable was out came a roadmap for zero discharges of hazardous chemicals by 2020. So this is an interesting initiative, but I think one of the things it signals is that individual companies can no longer do this on their own. Increasingly, we need pre-competitive research, and I hope that we will see more of that. And I suspect almost everyone online today will have seen the World Business Council for Sustainable Development's Vision 2050 map across multiple sectors out to the middle of the century. You may also have noted that there are a number of zero waste and zero emission targets out towards the 2040s and 2050s. And one of the things that Peter Backer, who's shown on the left, who was the former CFO and then CEO of TNT, is doing now that he's president of WBCSD, is stretching those earlier ambitions by cross-applying the planetary boundary work that's been done in Stockholm. And I think as that work continues, we'll see many more towards zero, net zero, zero, or beyond zero targets popping up. Then just a final slide in the sequence. One of the groups that we've been working with recently, well, for the last 2 years, is Richard Branson's B Team. Many people, again, will know that he's founded initiatives like the Carbon War Room, the Elders, the Gigaton Awards, and so on. But for us, the B Team is a very interesting new initiative. Jochen Zeitz on the right is the co-president with Richard, and the idea here is to convene CEOs, not now as representatives of their companies or sectors, but as citizens, to look at some of the really big, grand challenges that we face and to work collectively to address these. And I think one of the most exciting things there is that people like Peter Backer at WBCSD actually welcome this initiative as putting pressure on their own corporate membership. And one of the things that Peter said to me not that long ago was that he expects to lose something like 10 to 15% of his corporate members over time because of the raising of the bar that he now intends to make happen. Just to conclude, the question, and it's this one, and just in case anyone wonders where those those images floating up on the right came from, that's from Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic, which shows the sequence up to our ventures in space, but starting off with the people who strapped very elementary wings to their arms and jumped off cliffs. It's our feeling that we're very early on in the evolutionary curve in that respect, but some of these initiatives like the B Team are signaling next steps. So the question is, if the head or director of your organization was to join an initiative like the B Team and be asked the question of what his, her, or in this case, your priority challenge or related solutions would be, what would they be? And I think this is not just me asking. This is something that the B team itself is very interested in having feedback on. So that's more than enough from me. Again, apologies for the late start, and I'm now very open to having questions or comments.
Thanks a lot, John. Thanks a lot for this very insightful presentation. We already have a few questions. The first one being around alternative socioeconomic systems. So either alternative forms of capitalism or alternatives to capitalism.
Yeah.
So what can you say about this? And do you think there's in the world today a socioeconomic context that is more favorable to breakthrough capitalism, be it in, for instance, in China with state-owned capitalism, family business cultures, etc.?
Well, thanks for the question, and I didn't make it clear that nowhere in our thinking or work do we assume that the current models of capitalism are the ones that will be prevalent in the 2050s or whenever. And in fact, Volans has just been certified as a B corporation, which again, most people will have at least heard of. Whether or not they know what that means, an American approach to corporate form, which enables and encourages companies to embrace the social, the environmental, the ethical components of the business challenge. But you mentioned family business, and we've recently been working with a couple of family businesses and the Family Business Network in Singapore, and I think this is a hugely unexplored territory, and yet family businesses control a very big slice of different regional economies, and Asia would be very much a case in point, and they tend on balance to think longer term, whether or not they invest in appropriate ways, than publicly listed companies. So I think a very critical area to focus on. And state-owned industries and sovereign wealth funds would be two other sectors of the economy, which I think very often we tend to ignore. And I sometimes use the analogy, the old joke about somebody finding a drunk in the street at night, casting around under a street lamp, and asked what the drunk is doing. He or she answers, looking for their car keys. And the question then is this where you lost them? And the answer was no, but it's where the light is. And I think very often we focus on brands and high-profile companies and publicly listed companies when they're not necessarily either where some of the biggest problems are or where some of the biggest prospects for solutions might be in future. Happy to dig into that a bit in more detail if people want, but that's an initial response.
Thank you. There are some questions around more traditional forms of companies. So, what incentives can you suggest for C corps, for the more traditional type of capitalist companies out there? Is there any hope with this existing model of companies?
Well, I think if business is one thing, it is at its leading edge and its best adaptable. I mean, much more so than the sort of public sector or government. So, yes, there's hope, but should we assume that the current models, the current forms of valuation, the current forms of pricing of assets, and so on, that those will just crank forward decade by decade? Absolutely not. I think there are going to be convulsive changes. And if you start to look at some of the work that people like Pavan Sukhdev have been doing with the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, the implications of some of the economics of climate change work that Nick Stern and others have been doing, and you put all of that together, I suspect that this sort of manic charge towards nanosecond trading in companies is going to fall apart. I think it's not only unsustainable in its own terms, but it utterly distracts managements from what they should be paying attention to in terms of the longer term health of their companies and businesses and the society within which they sort of operate. And I think what Paul Pullman, as CEO of Unilever, did in saying to financial analysts, if you want quarterly reporting or forecasting, if you want to trade our stocks in a sort of micro nanosecond basis, we do not want you as investors in our company. I think it's brave. Some might even see it as foolhardy, but that to me is a very weak early signal of a coming different crisis in short-term capitalism. I happen to think that out of that will come something better, but it's by no means guaranteed.
Right. A couple other questions linked to this. So if we stay with the existing big corporations, what can you tell about potentially existing current research on free competitive research on shared risks on water, for instance, which is something very local but shared, can be shared among competitors or within a community, or other environmental issues?
Yeah, it's a balance, isn't it? Because in many ways, or it's a tension in the sense that companies that could make, or sectors that could make a big breakthrough in terms of an area like water efficiency might well get a head start on their competitors. And just before I come on to the question, to give you one example, I was in California about 18 months ago, and I sat next to a woman whose business is based on satellite data, and she advises companies like Frito-Lay on where the rain is falling and where the drought conditions are developing, and predicts from that what the price of, for example, potatoes will be. So there's a very big competitive advantage in getting an edge on other players in your sector on some of these issues. So although one would love to see a great deal of pre-competitive work, I think that there are barriers, and one of the barriers, and it's one that we should support in many ways, is the sort of the antitrust legislation that when you have companies like the sportswear brands getting together in the zero discharge pre-competitive alliance, the lawyers were all over that, trying to reassure top management that this would not be seen as anti-competitive. But then to the water issue, I think what we are seeing is a small number of companies that are very considerable water users and operate in different parts of the world. So a very early example of that would have been Intel operating in Israel and New Mexico, among other places. But both of those geographies being pretty water stressed, being forced to get into new technologies that were much more water efficient. Coca-Cola in Kerala, in India, got into some really nasty spats with local communities around who was draining the local aquifers, fastest. And Nestle, one of the companies, I should declare an interest, we work with Nestle, we also work with Intel, but finding that water security was in effect one of the three big strategic areas of concern in their business, the other two being rural development and nutrition. But in the case of water security, not simply going it alone, but Peter Brabeck, as their now chairman, through the World Economic Forum, building an alliance of people who firstly commissioned water cost curve studies from McKinsey, but are now really trying to work with business, with investors, and with policymakers and governments to get people to wake up to the scale of the water challenges that we face. So I've gone through some of the constraints on the pre-competitive approach, but I think we have to see a lot more of it in the future.
All right. A couple questions around if we move away from what the big guys can do. Questions around alternatives. So you talked about social innovation. Questions are, what do you mean by this? Do you have really good examples? Do you see local or regional initiatives and corporations as the drivers of this future we want?
Well, one of the things that when question came up earlier on about different forms of capitalism that I didn't get into was the cooperative sector, and I think again it had its heyday and now is to some degree overlooked in all of this, but plays a really important role still. And when people like Ed Mayo have looked at the scale of the sector, it is immense. So I think again one of these sectors that we should be paying more attention to, but traditionally or historically one that has tended to focus much more on the social side of the agenda than the environmental. Doesn't mean that they can't do that, and the organic part of the agenda has been adopted by some parts of the cooperative movement. But one of the things I've done over the last 10 years is focus much more of my attention, both at sustainability and now at Volance, on social enterprise. And that comes in many, many different forms. I mean, you could even say, if you look at a very large company like Unilever, that that's a social enterprise at scale. It's not an argument they make, but if you look at companies like that and you look at their original intent, they were trying to address social and health problems, for example, in new ways. So I think social entrepreneurs, most of whom are operating at a much smaller scale. I mean, you can look at BRAC, you can look at Grameen, some of these organizations which are pretty large, but most of the people we come across are very much smaller. And I think what's very striking about social entrepreneurs, unlike activist campaigners and NGOs, is that who tend, and for very good reasons very often, to be nervous about working with mainstream business. The social entrepreneurs cannot wait, to put it crudely, to get into bed with the right sort of business partners. And some of the work that we do is very much at that interface. How do you? It's not a dating agency, but it's trying to do the sort of the due diligence on both sides to make sure that when the partnerships happen, they work well. So all I'm saying here is that instead of focusing either on the very big companies or on the very small social enterprises and what social innovators are doing in different parts of the world, maybe we should look at the sort of the hybridization zone between the two and what can be done to help some of the bigger players, not wreck the smaller ones, but actually help them replicate and scale what they're trying to do. And we see growing interest in that space, happily.
And do you have examples of such marriages happening?
Yeah, there are a fair few, and I'll go to a very different sector, but I can come back to the social space if it's asked for. I mean, I was last week in Atlanta with Janine Benyus and the Biomimicry 3.8 Institute. Biomimicry, most people will know, is the use of natural models as a source of ideas for solutions to big problems that we have. And what we're seeing is organizations like Biomimicry 3.8, where the 3.8 stands for 3.8 billion years of evolution. We're starting to see very large companies coming into that space and wanting to understand implications for their business. So, for example, Boeing might want to know what you can learn from shark skin, which has this sort of very fine pointy structure which creates turbulence around the moving shark to make its progress more energy efficient. So the question is, can you use that to skin fuselages of aircraft to make them more fuel efficient? I was reading in just Wired magazine this morning, a very different area, the study of colloids in the human body and the human bloodstream as a model for creating materials that assemble in appropriate conditions, which might be high flow, and disassemble in different conditions. They might be low flow. And the implication here might be that you can either come up with new drug structures or you can create self-healing paints. So that's taking a slightly more resource efficiency, energy efficiency route. But what we're finding too, to come into the social stroke financial area, is that some of the big banks, who are obviously in many forms of crisis simultaneously, are increasingly interested in the work of groups like Aflatun or Child Savings International or My Bank in this country, who are working with children to build their financial literacy. And in the case of Aflatun, in something like 80 countries around the world, they're working with children who very often have no access to money at all. So a lot of this seems a bit theoretical. But the idea is to train them so that if and when they do get money, they make sensible use of it. So I think, one could give many other examples of this, but I think it's an immensely exciting area. And as I say, there's interest on both sides of the divide now to work out how to make more of this stuff practical, relevant, and scalable.
Right. We have quite a few questions going back to the main driver of mainstream business, which is profits. So what incentives for the investor community to look long term rather than short term? What can we change the very idea of? Can we challenge the very idea of profitability for businesses, and also in the current context of in some parts of the world an aging population, and we think of the pressure of pension funds, how can we move away from this rather short mid-term profitability?
Well, I wish, Eric, there was a simple answer to that, and there isn't. And capitalism obsesses with, you might argue, profit and increasingly very short-term profitability. And I think one of the movements that's coming up now, and I had a guy in yesterday who is a venture capitalist but has run big public agencies in the United States, who was basically saying that much of what is now being done by managements is an abject betrayal of their fiduciary responsibility to their key stakeholders, that short-term profitability obsessions distract companies from what they should actually be doing. To your point around the aging trend, it's something that concerns me very considerably indeed. In fact, about 3 years ago, we set up an initiative called Second Half, working with Accenture and Cranfield University, and looking at what you might call a Venn diagram, the overlap between the aging trend and the fact, and then innovation, and then sustainability as an agenda. Those are the three main domains. As people get older, I don't need to tell any of us that they tend to become more conservative, but they don't change their political habits, and so that they tend to vote more energetically and actively, and they have more access to resources and networks of influence than younger people. So the aging trend tends to make societies more conservative. You then think about where their pension funds are invested. Very typically, they're in the big, successful, profitable businesses. I heard yesterday that BP, last time I heard it was 6 or 7% of British pensions linked to BP. Somebody gave the figure yesterday of 15%. I hope it's not anything like that high. But what people are then stuck with is, if they want their pensions, those pensions are based on dividends from very big and very often pretty unsustainable companies, or companies that are operating in unsustainable sectors. And then finally, you've got the sustainability piece, and the aging thing has another dynamic, which is that although people may fret about their children and grandchildren, there is a sense that, I won't be here to see this. So for all sorts of different reasons, I think, as with the different forms of business and enterprise, state-owned industries and family businesses and so on, the aging trend is one that we should be paying very much more attention to, and working out how we turn people as they age progressively into more active champions of our various agendas. As I started by saying, I don't think there's a single button that you can press that would solve all of those problems. It's a culture change issue, and I think it's going to be one that we have to work on for decades and generations even.
Right. All right. We're coming close to the end of our scheduled session. Do you want to add a few last words, John, before we come to a close?
Well, I suppose the only thing that comes to mind, again, apart from the apology for the disruptive start to things, is that one of the things I'm finding now on Friday I'm in Paris talking to a business school, and we do a lot of interactions now with not only universities but business schools, and it's really quite striking what's happening. That the students themselves are interested in these sorts of agendas in ways that would not historically have been the case. But at the same time, faculty are waking up, and it's really quite striking. I was at Wharton Business School last year, and there's something like 80 or 90 professors and senior lecturers and so on were there, and a couple of the deans from different business schools were saying, you know, at the moment we're teaching this as an option, but in the future this is going to be what we teach. So I think elements of that culture change are building. I think very often when cultures take off, they go much faster than we might expect. And just a final point, we often talk about paradigm shifts, and you know, if you're in the brand management area, you often mean sort of reformulation of a toothpaste or whatever. And what we understand by paradigms is the sorts of the big picture cultural framings of areas of science or whatever, and they change very slowly. Maybe it takes a couple of human generations for it to happen. It's our very strong sense that we're about 65 years into one of those very profound shifts, and it will, we think, accelerate pretty violently in the next 15 to 20 years, which on the one hand is exciting, but on the other hand, every time this has happened before and new energies and opportunities are created, you find a very different set of people moving into the space with very different intentions. And people supporting, it might be protectionism, it might be xenophobia, not just sustainability. So it's up for grabs. I think we're pretty hopeful that we can make sense of all of this. We're encouraged by initiatives like the B Team and hopefully the revamped WBCSD, but it's a big stretch from where we are now to where we need to be, and that's what our sort of breakthrough capitalism and zero naught initiatives and platforms are basically trying to signal. So just finally, if anyone wants to complain or criticize or comment or add to the discussion, my email is john@volans.com, and I'd genuinely be very interested to hear from people.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, John, for sharing your time, your thoughts, being with us today. The next session, the next One Planet webinar will be on the 23rd of April, and we'll have a chance to catch up with Interface and see what they're up to with their Mission Zero. We'll hear from Ramon Aratia, who's the Sustainability Director for the Europe, Middle East, Africa, India regions. So that will be on the 23rd of April in a month from now. Last thing I'd like to mention before we split is this Saturday is Earth Hour, which I hope you are aware of. This is the biggest event worldwide to talk about climate change and mobilize our communities and our leaders to take the challenge seriously. So if you haven't planned anything, go to earthhour.org and you can find many ways to get involved in Earth Hour this Saturday. So that's it. Thanks a lot again to John Elkington. Thanks also a lot to 2 Degrees for hosting the One Planet webinars. We'll see you hopefully in a month from now. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.